For the elegiac poets, see Simonides of Amorgos. Simonides of Ceos was a Greek lyric poet born at Ulish on Ceos. The scholars of Hellenistic Alexandria included him in the canonical list of 9 lyric poets, along with Bacchylides and Pindar. Both Bacchylides and Pindar benefited from his innovative approach to lyric poetry, and he was more involved than either of them in the major events and personalities of their times. His fame owes much to traditional accounts of his colorful life, as one of the wisest of men, as a greedy miser, as an inventor of a system of mnemonics and also of some letters of the Greek alphabet. Such accounts include fanciful elements, yet he had a real influence on the sophistic enlightenment of the classical era. His fame as a poet rests largely on his ability to present basic human situations with affecting simplicity. In the words of the Roman rhetorician Quintilian, Simonides has a simple style, but he can be commended for the aptness of his language and for a certain charm. His chief merit, however, lies in the power to excite pity, so much so that some prefer him in this respect to all other writers of the genre. He is popularly associated with epitaphs commemorating fallen warriors, as for example the Lacedaemonians at the Battle of Thermopylae. Xi epsilon nu, gamma gamma epsilon lambda lambda epsilon iota nu lambda alpha kappa epsilon delta alpha iota mu omicron nu iota omicron iota sigma tau iota tau delta epsilon kappa epsilon iota mu epsilon theta alpha tau omicron sigma kappa epsilon iota nu omega nu eta mu alpha sigma iota pi epsilon iota theta omicron mu epsilon nu omicron iota. This was translated by F. L. Lucas as an English heroic couplet. Tell them in Lacedaemon, passer-by, that to hear, obedient to their word, we lie today. Only glimpses of his poetry remain, either in the form of papyrus fragments or quotations by ancient literary figures. Yet new fragments continue to be unearthed by archaeologists at Oxyrhynchus. His general fame as a wise and colorful personality has led to his inclusion in narratives as diverse as Mary Renault's historical novel The Praise Singer, Plato's Protagoras, and some verses in Callimachus Oetia. Biography. Few clear facts about Simonides' life have come down to modern times in spite of his fame and influence. Ancient sources are uncertain even about the date of his birth. According to the Byzantine Encyclopedia, Suda, he was born in the 56th Olympiad, or according to some writers in the 62nd, and he survived until the 78th. Having lived 89 years, modern scholars generally accept 556–468 BC for his life in spite of some awkward consequences. For example, it would make him about 50 years older than his nephew Bacchylides and still very active internationally at about 80 years of age. Other ancient sources also have awkward consequences. For example, according to an entry in the Parian Marble, Simonides died in 468 7th BC at the age of 90. Yet, in another entry, it lists a victory by his grandfather in a poetry competition in Athens in 489–488 BC. This grandfather must have been over 100 years old at that time if the birth dates for Simonides are correct. The grandfather's name, as recorded by the Parian Marble, was also Simonides, and it has been argued by some scholars that the earliest references to Simonides in ancient sources might in fact be references to this grandfather. However, the Parian Marble is known to be unreliable, and possibly it was not even the grandfather but a grandson that won the aforementioned victory in Athens. According to the Suda, this grandson was yet another Simonides, and he was the author of books on genealogy. Early years. Ceos in Athens. Simonides is identified in the Suda as the son of Eleoprepes. He was born in Ulish on Ceos, the outermost island of the Cyclades. The innermost island, Delos, was the reputed birthplace of Apollo, where the people of Ceos regularly sent choirs to perform hymns in the god's honor. Carthia, another Cean town, included a co-regional school where choirs were trained, and possibly Simonides worked there as a teacher in his early years. In addition to its musical culture, Ceos had a rich tradition of athletic competition, especially in running and boxing, making it fertile territory for a genre of choral lyric that Simonides pioneered, the victory ode. Indeed, the grandfather of Simonides' nephew, Bacchylides, was one of the island's notable athletes. Ceos lies only some 15 miles southeast of Attica, whither Simonides was drawn, about the age of 30, by the lure of opportunities opening up at the court of the tyrant Hippicus, a patron of the arts. His rivalry there with another chorus trainer and poet, Lassus of Hermione, became something of a joke to Athenians of a later generation. It is mentioned briefly by the comic playwright Aristophanes, who earmarked Simonides as a miserly type of the professional poet middle career. Thessaly. After the assassination of Hippicus, Simonides withdrew to Thessaly, where he enjoyed the protection and patronage of the Scupidae and Aluidae. These were two of the most powerful families in the Thessalian feudal aristocracy, yet they seemed notable to later Greeks such as Theocritus only for their association with Simonides. Thessaly at that time was a cultural backwater, remaining in the Dark Ages until the close of the 5th century. According to an account by Plutarch, the Ionian poet once dismissed the Thessalians as too ignorant to be beguiled by poetry. Among the most colorful of his ignorant patrons was the head of the Scupidae clan, named Scopar, fond of drinking, convivial company and vain displays of wealth. This aristocrat's proud and capricious dealings with Simonides are demonstrated in a traditional account related by Cicero and Quintilian, according to which the poet was commissioned to write a victory ode for a boxer. Simonides embellished his ode with so many references to the twins Castor and Pollux that Scopar told him to collect half the commissioned fee from them. He would only pay the other half. Simonides, however, ended up getting much more from the mythical twins than just a fee. He owed them his very life. According to this story, he was called out of the feast hall to see two visitors who had arrived and were asking for him, presumably Castor and Pollux. As soon as he left the hall, it collapsed, killing everyone within. These events were said to have inspired him to develop a system of mnemonics based on images and places called the method of loci. The method of loci is one component of the art of memory. Career highlight: Persian Wars. The Thessalian period in Simonides' career is followed in most biographies by his return to Athens during the Persian Wars, and it is certain that he became a prominent international figure at that time, particularly as the author of commemorative verses. According to an anonymous biographer of Aeschylus, the Athenians chose Simonides ahead of Aeschylus to be the author of an epigram honoring their war dead at Marathon, which led the tragedian to withdraw sulking to the court of Hieron of Syracuse. The story is probably based on the inventions of comic dramatists, but it is likely that Simonides did in fact write some kind of commemorative verses for the Athenian victory at Marathon. His ability to compose tastefully and poignantly on military themes put him in great demand among Greek states after their defeat of the Second Persian invasion, when he is known to have composed epitaphs for Athenians, Spartans and Corinthians, a commemorative song for Leonidas and his men, a dedicatory epigram for Pausanias, and poems on the battles of Artemisium, Salamis, and Plataea. According to Plutarch, the Cean had a statue of himself made about this time, which inspired the Athenian politician Themistocles to comment on his ugliness. In the same account, Themistocles is said to have rejected an attempt by the poet to bribe him, then likened himself as an honest magistrate to a good poet, since an honest magistrate keeps the laws and a good poet keeps in tune. Suda mentions a feud between Simonides and the Rhodian lyric poet Timocreon, for whom Simonides apparently composed a mock epitaph that touches on the issue of the Rhodians' Medism, an issue that also involved the Themistocles' final years. Sicily. The last years of the poet's life were spent in Sicily, where he became a friend and confidant of Hieron of Syracuse. According to a scholiast on Pindar, he once acted as peacemaker between Hieron and another Sicilian tyrant, Theron of Acragas, thus ending a war between them. Scholiasts are the only authority for stories about rivalry between Simonides and Pindar at the court of Hieron, traditionally used to explain some of the meanings in Pindar's victory odes. If the stories of rivalry are true, it may be surmised that Simonides' experiences at the courts of the tyrants, Hippicus and Scopar, gave him a competitive edge over the proud Pindar and enabled him to promote the career of his nephew, Bacchylides, at Pindar's expense. However, Pindar scholiasts are generally considered unreliable, and there is no reason to accept their account. The Hellenistic poet Callimachus revealed in one of his poems that Simonides was buried outside Acragas and that his tombstone was later misused in the construction of a tower. Biographical themes. Traditional accounts of the poet's life embody a variety of themes. Miraculous escapes. As mentioned above, both Cicero and Quintilian are sources for the story that Scopar, the Thessalian nobleman, refused to pay Simonides in full for a victory ode that featured too many decorative references to the mythical twins, Castor and Pollux. According to the rest of the story, Simonides was celebrating the same victory with Scopar and his relatives at a banquet when he received word that two young men were waiting outside to see him. When he got outside, however, he discovered firstly that the two young men were nowhere to be found and, secondly, that the dining hall was collapsing behind him. Scopar and a number of his relatives were killed. Apparently the two young men were the twins and they had rewarded the poet's interest in and by thus saving his life. Simonides later benefited from the tragedy by deriving a system of mnemonics from it. Quintilian dismisses the story as a fiction because the poet nowhere mentions the affair, although he was not in the least likely to keep silent on a matter which brought him such glory. This, however, was not the only miraculous escape that his piety afforded him. There are two epigrams in the Palatine anthology, both attributed to Simonides and both dedicated to a drowned man whose corpse the poet and some companions are said to have found and buried on an island. The first is an epitaph in which the dead man is imagined to invoke blessings on those who had buried the body, and the second records the poet's gratitude to the drowned man for having saved his own life. Simonides had been warned by his ghost not to set sail from the island with his companions, who all subsequently drowned. The Inventor. During the excavation of the rubble of Scopar dining hall, Simonides was called upon to identify each guest killed. Their bodies had been crushed beyond recognition, but he completed the gruesome task by correlating their identities to their positions at the table. Before his departure, he later drew on this experience to develop the memory theatre, or memory palace, a system for mnemonics widely used in oral societies until the Renaissance. According to Cicero, Themistocles wasn't much impressed with the poet's invention. "I would rather a technique of forgetting, for I remember what I would rather not remember and cannot forget what I would rather forget." The Suda credits him also with inventing the third note of the lyre, and 4 letters of the Greek alphabet. Whatever the validity of such claims, a creative and original turn of mind is demonstrated in his poetry. He probably invented the genre of the victory ode, and he gave persuasive expression to a new set of ethical standards. The miser. In his play piece, Aristophanes imagined that the tragic poet Sophocles had turned into Simonides. He may be old and decayed, but these days, if you paid him enough, it'd go to sea in a sieve. A scholiast commenting on the passage wrote, "Simonides seems to have been the first to introduce money grabbing into his songs and to write a song for pay, and, as proof of it, quoted a passage from one of Pindar's odes, which he interpreted as covert criticism of Simonides. The same scholiast related a popular story that the poet kept two boxes, one empty and the other full, the empty one being where he kept favors, the full one being where he kept his money. According to Athenaeus, when Simonides was at Hieron's court in Syracuse, he used to sell most of the daily provisions that he received from the tyrant, justifying himself thus: "So that all may see Hieron's magnificence and my moderation." Aristotle reported that a wife of Hieron once asked Simonides whether it was better to be wealthy or wise, to which he apparently replied, "Wealthy, for I see the wise spending their days at the doors of the wealthy." According to an anecdote recorded on a papyrus dating to around 250 BC, Hieron once asked the poet if everything grows old. "Yes," Simonides answered, "all except money-making, and kind deeds age most quickly of all." He once rejected a small fee to compose a victory ode for the winner of a mule race, but, according to Aristotle, changed his mind when the fee was increased, resulting in this magniloquent opening: "Greetings, daughters of storm-footed horses." In a quote recorded by Plutarch, he once complained that old age had robbed him of every pleasure but making money. All these amusing anecdotes might simply reflect the fact that he was the first poet to charge fees for his services. Generosity is glimpsed in his payment for an inscription on a friend's epitaph, as recorded by Herodotus. Herodotus also mentions an earlier poet, Arion, who had amassed a fortune on a visit to Italy and Sicily. So maybe Simonides wasn't the first professional poet, as claimed by the Greeks themselves. The sage and wit Plato, in the Republic, numbered Simonides with Bias and Pittacus among the wise and blessed, even putting into the mouth of Socrates the words, "It is not easy to disbelieve Simonides, for he is a wise man and divinely inspired." But in his dialogue Protagoras, Plato numbered Simonides with Homer and Hesiod as precursors of the sophist. A number of apocryphal sayings were attributed to him. Michael Solos credited him with "The word is the image of the thing." Plutarch commended the saying of Simonides, that he had often felt sorry after speaking but never after keeping silent, and observed that Simonides calls painting silent poetry and poetry painting that speaks. Diogenes Laertius, after quoting a famous epigram by Cleobulus in which a maiden sculptured on a tomb is imagined to proclaim her eternal vigilance, quotes Simonides commenting on it in a poem of his own: "Stone is broken even by mortal hands. That was the judgment of a fool." His rationalist view of the cosmos is evinced also in Plutarch's letter of consolation to Apollonius. According to Simonides, 1,000 or 10,000 years are an undeterminable point, or rather the tiniest part of a point. Cicero related how, when Hieron of Syracuse asked him to define God, Simonides continually postponed his reply, because the longer I deliberate, the more obscure the matter seems to me. Stobaeus recorded this reply to a man who had confided in Simonides some unflattering things he had heard said about him: "Please stop slandering me with your ears.